Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today we want to talk about boundaries, territories. Ultimately what we're talking about is political geography. So let's start off by saying, oh, by the way, I just love this picture because it has all the flags, so enjoy. Let's start off with this idea of territoriality. We are, like many animals, very territorial because within our territory we find all the things that we need to survive. So when we start talking about territoriality, in a political sense, we're talking about a country or community, whatever, clan, tribe, whatever. It's your sense of property and your attachment towards this space, right, this territory. And typically it's expressed by this determination to keep it yours, right, to keep it defended. And so oftentimes it's a huge source of conflict, and that's one of the things that's going to come up repeatedly in this unit. Okay. Now, first of all, let's talk about size. Which of the following is currently the world's largest state territorially? These are some good choices. These are all pretty big. I will tell you, Canada seems huge on a map, but it turns out, remember, that has to do with the type of map projection that we're talking about. Russia also looks huge, and both of these places are large, right? The United States is very large. India has a large population, but it's not particularly large space-wise. Egypt was only really a small part of northern Africa. And then Russia, actually, while some of it is kind of spread out because of the Mercator projection, it turns out that Russia is actually huge. And so Russia is the largest state in terms of its actual physical size, which brings us to the different kinds of shapes that you find: states, nations, countries, whatever you want to say. We'll define all those words in just a second. But you have a couple of basic different shapes. The first one is compact, okay? This is where you have sort of a roundish kind of state. I mean, you can have, there's a center, and pretty much the entire boundary is, you know, plus or minus about the same distance from it. Now you have elongated, which is also called attenuated, and that's like Chile. You have this nice stretched out space here. This is coastal, which is helpful for them, by the way, just as an aside. But you have this nice, like, you know, well, elongated. There you go. Then fragmented means that you have two or more separate pieces. The United States actually is a good example of a fragmented country because we have Hawaii and Alaska that are not near our actual, you know, the continental United States. But the example here is the Philippines. Then you have perforated. This is where you have a state within a state. Okay, and here you have South Africa and you have Lesotho, which is right in here. Really, another good example is Vatican City. Okay, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure why those fonts are actually different sizes. That does not mean anything, just FYI. And then you have protruded, okay, also called prorupt. And a protruded area is where you have this compact core, like you see here in Thailand, but then you have this like elongated extension off of it, and that's the prorupt part. Okay. All right, so there's just some shapes, and this kind of will help you in terms of looking at conflicts, right? Because a lot of shapes come from disputes. Okay, so let's talk about a state. What is a state when we say that? It is because I think when we say state, we have a lot of different things that we mean. But basically, it's a defined territory on the Earth's surface. It has a permanent population. It's got sovereignty. And sovereignty means that it has control of all of its affairs independent from any other group, right? It's its own thing. It's got economic activity, and moreover has an organized economy. It's got a transportation system that helps facilitate all of these other things that are going on. It has the power of education, which is often called social engineering, and that can mean different things to different people, and it certainly means different things in different places. Education systems can be used to further agendas. That is definitely true in lots of places. So I like to call it the power of education, but do remember that if the state is in control of it, sometimes it has other purposes. And then you have the government that provides services to the people and defends the territory, and other countries recognize this independence, this sovereignty. Okay, and when we talk about sovereignty, this is actually not something that's been around for a really long time. At the end of the 30 Years' War, there was the Peace of Westphalia, or the Treaty of Westphalia. And this is actually the document that sets legal precedent for national sovereignty. And in this slide, I've actually put in the text down there a whole article about what happened, the summary of that. So check that out so you can see. But this is the reason that we have really fully recognized autonomous states. Now, let's talk about country, nation, state. We kind of use those interchangeably, but they're actually not, right? State and country are interchangeable. Nation and state are not. A nation is an identity, right? It's a group of people that are bound together. They are usually of the same ethnicity, the same culture, customs, belief. Sometimes it's the same legal status, but basically you have something more than just a boundary that unites these people, okay? A state is a political unit that's ruled by an established government and has sovereignty, okay? Sometimes you have nation states. Sometimes you have states that are not nations, and sometimes you have nations that don't have states, right? Really famous that you should be familiar with are the Kurds, right? They are a stateless nation. And that's been a source of huge conflict for them. So one of the questions that we want to ask in this modern world, are there still any states that actually meet the definition of nation-state? Because back in the day when states were being formed, lots of them, most of them, were nation-states, right? So when we start looking at nation-states, interestingly, you can start to see that, the key is left off. Okay. So this is like 95% or higher. This I think is 70% higher. This is about 30 to 60%. And then this is anything below 30-40% to nothing in terms of ethnic majorities. Okay. But interestingly, there are actually still a number of places that have ethnic majorities. And on this slide, I've actually put a list of some of those where you have the ethnic populations making up more than 95%, and just some highlights. Bangladesh, a place we're going to talk about. Egypt, we're going to talk about. Are just a couple of them. There are several places in Europe. Hungary, Iceland, right, are some of those places. Lebanon is one of those places. A lot of the Arabic states are actually. Several of the African countries also are going to be those. Mongolia, we've already talked about. And then, interestingly, North and South Korea both have different cultures, and it's one of the problems between them. We'll talk about that in just a second. Poland, right? Not for good reasons, which we'll talk about later on. But anyway, those are just some examples of places that are still nation states, more or less. Okay. Now, I would like to point out at this time that there's also the idea of a national identity. That does not make a nation state. It just means that some countries have sort of a culture. If you think about states sort of having personalities of their own, some of them have more striking personalities, and I think a really good example of that is Switzerland. Okay, while they have different language that are spoken there, when you think of something Swiss, a very clear picture comes to mind, and that's because they have a national identity. They're not a nation state, right? Okay, now which of the following is a state? Korea, China, Western Sahara, or Nigeria? Well, interestingly, we might say that all of them are, because when we think about them, we think of that as like, oh, those are countries. Well, sort of, right? Korea, that's kind of iffy, right? Because there's two of them. Western Sahara is the source of huge conflict, as is Nigeria. Really, the only one on here that is actually an autonomous state, has sovereignty, is independent, all of those good things, is actually China. Okay, so what are the problems defining states? Right now, as of December 2014, there are 195 states according to the United Nations. In 2003, there were 191, and in 2010, there were 196. So this number is pretty flexible, and the question becomes why? And that's because some places really test the definition of what it means to be a state, right? And so remember the criteria for being a state. There were 8 of them, okay? So let's talk about Korea. The Korean Peninsula is divided into two countries, actually along the 38th parallel for political reasons. And you have the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is North Korea, and you have the ROK, the Republic of Korea, which is South Korea. Now, ideologically, they're very different. The North is very different. We're going to talk about North Korea again because it's a dictatorship, right? Which in fancy terms is called an authoritarian socialist country. South Korea is a republic, but it's actually a democratic republic. Both countries have tried to actually unify Korea, but they have not been able to do it because they can't actually agree on what that should look like, so they remain two different countries. China and Taiwan, while China is an independent state, I mean, it is a state, Taiwan is having a little conflict with that. Ultimately, they think that they are an independent state, and China thinks that Taiwan is part of China. And there was a civil war. They separated in 1999. There were the nationalists and the communists in China. The nationalists fled to Taiwan. They did not want to be part of communist China. Mainland China refused to recognize that Taiwan didn't want to be part of that. And still today, Taiwan is not actually its own state, even though it thinks it does. However, most other governments actually do consider them to be separate and sovereign, even though the sovereignty of Taiwan is unofficial. And in the notes of the last slide, I actually put a whole little thing about, does Taiwan meet the 8 criteria? And I would like you to read that. Okay, and now let's look at Western Sahara. Western Sahara has changed a lot. You can see that here you have Mauritania, and here you have Morocco. And Morocco and Mauritania both claim Western Sahara, or at least parts of it. And so you've had all of these different boundaries based on the relationships between here. And actually, for a while, Algeria played into that, but they relinquished any sort of claim on it. Now it's just Mauritania and Morocco. And even still today, they're trying to get Mauritania and Morocco to come together to actually figure it out, right, how they're going to deal with that. And in the last instance, Morocco actually refused to come to the table. On this one, I've actually put an article about what's going on in Western Sahara, and I'd like you to check that out as well. So, right, while it's considered to be an independent sovereign state by most of Africa, okay, Morocco and Mauritania don't look at that, and this is an area of actual hot conflict. I mean, there are skirmishes, firefights, things like that. And so this is actually a more violent border dispute than, say, Taiwan and China. Or the Koreas. There's a stalemate there. Not a lot of violence. Okay, so let's talk about boundaries themselves, right? Because you've got this territory, this state, right? Whatever you are having here. You have to have some sort of boundary to let people know, right? And you've got the boundary, which is a vertical plane that cuts through the subsoil and through space, right? So when people talk about flying into somebody's airspace, they're talking about flying over the border, right, the boundary, because that is all belonging, everything below and above the state within the boundaries belongs to that state, okay? And the definition is usually a legal document or a treaty that's drawn up to specify the actual points on the landscape, okay? Delimitation is cartographers will put that boundary on the map to let everybody know, hey, this is where it is. And demarcation is actually the physical marking of the boundary. That can be on with markers. It can be a wall, fence, post, whatever. This is the boundary along the 38th parallel. And of course, you have North Korea and South Korea, right? And so you're looking into North Korea from South Korea. And then here, this little thing right here is the Berlin Wall. And that was an actual physical wall that divided East and West Germany. So sometimes you actually have a real thing. Not all boundaries are demarcated. Okay. All right, so here's your next question. The international boundary between the United States and Canada, west of the Great Lakes, is classified as a superimposed, geometric, natural political, relict, or antecedent boundary. Well, we probably want to define these terms, but I'm going to tell you this one is a geometric boundary. Well, what is that? There are 3 big types of boundaries. There are geometric boundaries, that's the straight line. They're unrelated to any sort of physical or cultural landscape. They're usually along latitude and longitude lines. United States and Canada is a really good example of that. Now, there are physical political, also called natural political. These conform to geographic features, okay? Rivers, mountains, right? The Rio Grande or Rio Grande is the U.S.-Mexico border. The Pyrenees Mountains are the Spanish-French border, okay? Then there are cultural political boundaries, and this is a boundary between cultures, right? And so it's a break in the human landscape, okay? And Armenia and Azerbaijan are good examples of that. So we move to the classification of boundaries, if my slide will change. There it is. Okay. There are antecedent boundaries. They existed before the cultural landscape, so these are ancient boundaries. There are subsequent boundaries. These develop with the evolution of cultural landscapes as cultures start to settle and things like that. Superimposed are put on an area by an outside power that has nothing to do with the actual culture. Relict boundaries are boundaries that are defunct, but you can still see the imprint of those boundaries on the cultural landscape. And I'm going to give you examples of all of these. And then a frontier boundary is kind of a zone of separation. And this is where you have some sort of territory that's like a cushion that keeps rivals apart. Okay, so there's a frontier is a zone of separation. Okay, so here is the antecedent boundary. Right, and looking back, you can see the antecedent existed before the cultural landscape, right? I don't know why I flashed back to that slide. We just talked about it. Sorry about that. Anyway, so Malaysia and Indonesia, this boundary is no longer relevant in terms of the actual culture of the people, but it is still the boundary, okay? Vietnam and China is a subsequent boundary. You have two different cultures going on here, right? Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, this is a superimposed boundary, and you can see that it actually follows nothing, right? It's a geometric boundary. And then Vietnam, right, divided into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. This is a relic boundary because they are a single country, but they didn't used to. Remember, they had a horrible civil war, which the Vietnam War would have been about, and so that's a relic boundary. Okay, which of the following areas is there currently a border dispute, right? Scotland and England, Hong Kong, Indonesia, New Guinea, Haiti, the Dominican, that should be Dominican Republic, not Dominica Republic, that's crazy talk, I left off the end, sorry about that, and Kashmir. Well, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, they are two countries, they're on the same island, they're mostly doing okay with each other. Same thing with Indonesia and New Guinea. Hong Kong has gone back to China. It's no longer British. That happened in 1997. And Scotland and England recently had a vote where Scotland could have voted to be its own country because, you know, they've been at war for like 1,000 years about it. And Scotland said, no, we actually want to be a part of England. We need it. Okay, they haven't been in an active war for a long time, but if you know anything about British history, then you know that the Scots and the British did not get along for most of their history together. Kashmir, on the other hand, is still being disputed by Pakistan and India, and it's a huge thing, and I've put another article in here, but it's a mountain region, and basically it's been a huge problem even before India and Pakistan won their independence from Britain, but basically it was part of Pakistan, and there's this whole situation where is it really part of Pakistan? India wants it, Pakistan wants it, you know, so there you go. Boundary disputes, they can be definitional. This has to, definitional, there we go, focuses on the actual definition of the boundary, so it's a legal action. Where is the median line of a river, because water levels vary, things like that. How much access do you have to the coast, stuff like that. Location, the definition is not in dispute, but the way that the interpretation is actually on for delimitation, that is flexible, right? And so you have to actually all agree on what the delimitation is that's happening. Operational, neighbors really don't agree on how the boundary should work, and that's where you get migration and smuggling. And then allocational is where you have rights to natural resources that can be gas, water, oil, and that is because the reserve or aquifer, whatever, crosses some sort of actual boundary. Okay, Iraq and Kuwait, really good example of that. They have been in conflict over this particular oil field for a long time, and so there you go. And then there are boundaries above the state boundaries that cause problems. The Berlin Wall, right, which was in Berlin, but here's the actual Iron Curtain kind of situation. No, yes, wow, okay. There we go. There's the word. But anyway, so this is your Iron Curtain situation where you have the Soviet Union holding this part. You have the not Soviet Union, right? West Germany that's free, which would actually be right here, not right there. And then you have all of these satellite states, which are now all independent when the Iron Curtain fell. And so that was a huge dispute because most of these countries didn't actually want to be part of the Iron Curtain. And then you have NATO countries, new NATO countries, countries that want to be in NATO, countries that don't want to be in NATO, right? And so these are considered like above the state boundaries because they group countries into larger areas. Colonialism provided a lot of the modern boundaries that you see today in the developing world. Sometimes those work really well, sometimes they don't. In Africa, political independence has also brought economic independence. Is this true or false? Well, this actually turns out to be false, right? The colonial groups, right, the colonial countries came in and they put boundaries onto lots of places that did not work, and so many of those countries became independent later. But the political independence did not give them the economic dependence that they also wanted and needed, and this is something we're going to talk about when we start talking about development. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is supranationalism. And supranationalism is where you have 3 or more states, countries, that are working together for political, economic, military, and or cultural objectives. And I've put in an example of each. Political is the UN, economic is the EU, military is NATO, and cultural is going to be the African Union. And an example of one of the first groups that actually joined in most of these categories is Benelux. It was Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, and they actually were the first really multinational union. So they had no tariffs between each other, no quotas. They had reciprocity on licenses, and eventually they joined the European Economic Community, but they were the ones who really started that first big kind of cooperative venture. All right, so if you have any questions, please let me know at the beginning of class. I'll see you next time, and thanks for listening.